My name is Jonathan Elkind. I'm with the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I am very pleased to welcome everybody here for this evening's book talk with Jim Krane from the Baker Institute at Rice University. I think we have ahead of us a very interesting discussion tonight. For people in the energy world and for people in the foreign policy and national security worlds, there certainly are no group of countries that are more important than the Gulf Arab states: Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. They're central to today's energy economy, and depending on how quickly and in what ways one thinks the transition to carbon-free energy will unfold, if indeed it will, they can be expected, these countries, to be central to tomorrow's energy economy as well. They have been the topic of intense focus for national security decision makers in the United States for decades, as I think we all recognize. Their energy development and economic policy decisions have huge ramifications both inside their own borders and around the globe. They face challenging choices about where they wish to go and what attributes they will have as they proceed, especially in relation to the climate challenge that I just referred to. And for these reasons, we are extremely fortunate to have as the focus of our discussion this evening this fascinating new book. I'll hold up Amy's copy. Energy Kingdoms, Oil and Political Survival in the Persian Gulf. Tonight we'll begin by asking Jim to give us a presentation about some of the key findings in his book, and then we'll have a bit of a panel discussion among the three of us here. We are joined by Amy Jaffe, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her background in a moment, but suffice to say that we'll have the basis for a really great initial conversation, and then we will invite questions from members of the audience as well. So please be prepared for that, which we will come to in due course. And we'll have microphones brought around to people as they are recognized to pose a question. Let me note that tonight's program is on the record, and like almost all of the Center's public events here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, it is being live streamed as well. So audience members, both those here in the room and those who may be chickened out and didn't decide to go through the lovely weather outside to join us in person, you may all pose questions using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. Again, that's the hashtag CGEP events and the Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. So just to take a minute to introduce our featured speaker and our panelist as well, Jim Krane is the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute. His research addresses the geopolitical aspects of energy with a focus on the Middle East and the OPEC states and their political and economic strategies. He's the author of the 2009 book City of Gold, Dubai and the Dream of Capitalism. Before joining the Baker Institute, Dr. Krane was a longtime journalist who reported from the Middle East for the Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, Economist Intelligence Unit, Financial Times, and many other I'm resisting the urge to make a fake news joke. I'll just stop there. Many other organizations. Dr. Krane is a member of Cambridge University's Energy Policy Research Group, where he received his PhD. He also holds an MPhil in Technology Policy from Cambridge University's Judge Business School and a Master's in International Affairs from, you guessed it, Columbia University. Amy Myers Jaffe is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment and Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Speaking parochially, I would highlight the fact that she is also the co-chair of the Center on Global Energy Policy's Women in Energy Steering Committee. Amy served previously as Executive Director for Energy and Sustainability at the University of California, Davis, and Senior Advisor on Energy and Sustainability in the Office of the Chief Investment Officer for for the University of California Regents. She formerly was the Wallace S. Wilson Fellow for Energy Studies and was the founding director of the Energy Forum at the Baker Institute. She has taught at Rice University, University of California, Davis, and Yale. She holds a bachelor's from Princeton University in Near Eastern and Studies and Arabic. So we have the basis for what I think you will find to be a really stimulating and interesting program tonight, looking at a challenging bunch of questions brought to us in the form of a really great book. So, Jim, I'd like to turn it over to you now for your presentation, and maybe Amy and I will run over here so that we...
Well, thanks for the fantastic introduction, John. It's not that often that you get two Wallace S. Wilson Fellows in the same in the same event. So I really appreciate Amy coming along and lending a hand and giving us her thoughts on this as well. As John mentioned, I actually went to SEPA, so I spent a lot of time in this building. So from 99 to I think 2001, maybe it was when I was working at the AP. So I did a part-time degree here, and it's nice to be back. I sort of remember the rooms being bigger and a little bit more grand. And it's funny how your memory works. But it's fantastic to be back. So, and I'm very grateful that Columbia University Press also put the book out too. So my book looks in detail at energy issues in the 6 Gulf monarchies. Okay, so Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and Bahrain. But rather than focusing, as most of the time, the way these countries are treated is in their role as supplying the world with energy. This book takes a bit of a different tack and really looks at their own energy demand. So I want to break it down to my talk down into 3 themes really quickly. First, I'll cover a bit of the historical background behind some of the issues that I want to talk about. Then we'll move into looking at some of the runaway energy consumption in the Gulf and some government policies that's driven that and that's tackling it. And then we'll finish up with this sort of vexing issue of climate change. So in the pre-oil days, parts of the Gulf looked like this. Okay, this is Riyadh in the 1950s. Nowadays, as we know, cities in the Gulf look more like this. Okay, or maybe like this, or like that. Okay, that's Riyadh more recently. It didn't take that long. There isn't, there's might be people in this room that were, there's definitely people in this room that were alive in the 1950s or were teenagers in the 1950s. Maybe some people that spent some time in the region in the 1950s, if we're lucky, and remember this stuff, right? So here's Dubai. It's probably it's probably 1960 because you can see that the creek is being dredged. That's pretty much all there was to Dubai in 1960. Okay, and this is more what it looks like now. Okay, so this is really the story of this really compressed, really dramatic level of development, a very short period. And that's what my first book is about. This book, I think, looks at something that I think is equally remarkable, and it's these guys these are the folks that are still the families that are still in power today, and they held on through that period of massive change that I just showed you. Okay, and they did that in defiance of academic predictions. Right, there were a lot of academics saying that these guys could not hold on to power, that they were anachronisms, and they'd be overthrown pretty quickly. So, if you want to put that into a useful context for this audience, if you think about Native American tribes here in the United States retaining power throughout this sort of massive, immigration and upheaval. Okay, not a perfect counterfactual, but it's a way of thinking about, the likelihood of these, fairly basic tribes retaining absolute power. Okay, rule in the Gulf monarchies is always revolved around patronage, okay, which is basically giving people stuff. Before oil, patronage depended on the sheikh's ability to squeeze funds from parties who sought access into the region, okay? So it might have been, foreign powers, or, in the case of Saudi Arabia, Hajj pilgrims. That was one of the key sources of revenue for Ibn Saud, the first Saudi king. So in the 1930s, we saw global competition for oil, access to oil heating up, starting to focus on these hermit kingdoms of the Gulf. There were some big discoveries, first in Bahrain, then in Kuwait, and then in 1938 in Saudi Arabia. And it quickly became apparent that these were pretty much the perfect petro-states. So you had just one man that called the shots in these countries. The ruler's diwan was really your only stop. There was no private claims on the oil or on the land above it. Rulers were willing to cede huge concessions, okay, like this one, a third larger than the state of Texas, for very little money. The geology was, of course, unbeatable. And I think one of the key parts of this is that there was just about zero domestic demand in these sheikdoms at the time for oil. So that meant that all of it could be exported, okay? So oil was of almost no use. Transportation was powered by animals or the wind at this time. People used biomass for cooking and for heat. And that was really about it. So you had U.S. and British companies that won these concessions. Concessions worked pretty well for a few decades, but as the host governments began to understand the scale of the national wealth that they'd consigned to foreign ownership, the concession terms began to be seen as an embarrassment, and over time, host governments began to unwind them. Okay? So, in the Middle East, nationalization really came about alongside this geopolitical confrontation. So the Arab host countries had made an issue of U.S. backing for Israel, and had become an irritant in otherwise pretty good relations. Saudi King Faisal was particularly upset by this, and his frustrated that his repeated entreaties in Washington had gotten him nowhere. So in 1973, when the U.S. famously stepped in to rearm Israel during the 1973 war, and helping Israel defeat Syria and Egypt, King Faisal retaliated. Okay, and as we know, he and the Arab OPEC members raised prices, they cut shipments to the U.S., and they cut production by 5% a month. Okay, so the timing in all of this was pretty impeccable. Okay, so you had the nationalization process that had already been started, and in some of the countries around the Gulf had been completed by then. Some would be completed shortly afterward in 1974. The Saudis were probably the laggard in this. They didn't fully nationalize. They didn't take the final 40% until 1980. So the combined effects of nationalization and the embargo and the price increase were pretty amazing. They brought really an enormous shift in the terms of the crude oil trade globally, and really a spectacular transfer of wealth and power from west to east. See, some of the effects. You had the price of oil quadrupling from $3 to $12. So a much bigger share of the oil rents was now flowing to producer governments, okay, rather than to the IOCs, to the international oil companies. And so the amount of revenues went way up, okay? So Saudi revenues jumped 40-fold between 1965 and 1975. So from about 650 million to almost 27 billion. So in pretty short order, these countries got fairly wealthy, okay? And as we know, there are few indicators that predict growth in energy demand like growth in income, okay? So how did all this play out in domestic policy in the Gulf? Well, after the embargo, the sheikhs suddenly had a lot more patronage to hand out, and their citizens also had expectations. And so one of the main forms of patronage that they turned to was energy, okay? So in the 1970s, the governments began fixing prices of energy products and services that they now controlled at very low levels. And, they did this for, a few different reasons. Some of this was to share the wealth, this windfall that had taken place. They needed to distribute that. Some of this was because these governments really had pretty low administrative capacity. They didn't have a big knowledge about society at the time, and subsidies are a pretty easy way to share the wealth. And partly they did it to solidify support for the ruling families. So prices were left untouched in some cases for decades, or especially in the case of electricity, really for literally for decades. I mean, this if you look at the Kuwait tariff here. That has finally been tweaked in very recent years, but there was more than 50 years where the Kuwaiti electricity price, and I think this price still stands for citizens in their homes in Kuwait, 0.7 US cents per kilowatt hour. Okay, so very low. I mean, here in the US, average price is about 13 cents, right? So, so I can't find any evidence that any of these countries raised prices on electricity for at least 40 years. Okay, so the only changes that came was typically when they were lowered. So academics saw this and argued that, okay, this means that these subsidies are rights. Okay, these are rights of citizenship, and if regimes try to take them away, the public support for them, that's partly based on this, could unravel. So they were basically treated as a right. Now, outside the region where subsidies weren't considered rights, and in countries where people were exposed to fluctuating prices. When prices went up, people changed their behavior, right? So, you insulate your home, you might buy a smaller car, you might buy more efficient appliances, or you might use them less, right? But in the Gulf, people did not face those same incentives. Government policy basically, insulated them from these price information that would have changed their behavior. So, of course, energy demand grew very quickly. You didn't just have the effect of price, you had immigration to the Gulf, and you had increasing income as well. So after about 40 years of this, these once isolated kingdoms, fairly primitive kingdoms, became huge consumers of energy. Okay, so with some of the world's highest levels of per capita demand, and in the case of Saudi Arabia's oil consumption, some of the world's highest demand, period. Okay, so Saudi Arabia is now the world's number 5 consumer of oil. I mean, the only two countries that consume significantly more oil than Saudi Arabia are the U.S. and China. So if you look on here, Japan is Saudi Arabia is the heavy black line. Japan is the blue line at the top. You can see they're coming down there, and they're almost at the same level, and India has jumped ahead. So India and Japan are the other two countries that are ahead of Saudi Arabia. This type of demand growth really surprised a lot of people, including the International Energy Agency in Paris. And when I was living in Dubai in 2008, the IEA put out this report that announced that most of the Gulf monarchies could no longer meet their own needs in natural gas, which at the time I found pretty shocking. And that was the thing that really kind of piqued my interest in this topic. And when I went to Cambridge to do my PhD, that was the subject that I did it on. I started looking at just deconstructing demand for energy in the Gulf. We all knew that the Gulf was this supply region. That's how it was always treated. And lo and behold, it's becoming a demand region. So oil and gas reserves are still big, but an increasing share of the production was being diverted into these domestic markets. And since prices were subsidized, that was a revenue killer, right? So the barrel of oil that sells for $50 or $100 outside the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, selling for $5 in the kingdom, Aramco doesn't want to sell that many barrels in the kingdom if it doesn't have to. He wants to get it's an opportunity cost to sell that barrel. There's a big opportunity cost to sell that barrel domestically. So the export-dependent economies were basically being cannibalized by subsidized domestic demand. Okay, and disturbingly, political support for the ruling families was supposedly bound up in these subsidies, right? So the regimes were afraid to take them away. But the flip side was worse, right? So if you think about it, if the policymakers didn't do something, this continuing growth in domestic demand would divert ever more oil and gas, exportable oil and gas into the domestic economy. So they knew they had to do something. It's, oil exports are the lifeblood of the economy and this political system, right? So they knew they had to get demand under control. I did some survey work at the time that clearly demonstrated that policymakers knew this. They also revealed that policymakers were afraid to do this. Now, in 2011, they were readying plans. Most of these governments were readying plans to change prices. The Arab Spring broke out, okay? And regimes, that just made them even more scared to touch prices. They thought that if they started, changing prices, the Arab Spring might infect them too. But finally, by 2014, the dam really broke, okay? We had a flurry of price increases on this slide that really kind of, I think, demonstrates that they're not rights of citizenship, that these subsidies can be taken away and have really begun to be taken away. I don't know if you can read the type on that. This is a graphic just lifted directly from my book. But so what changed? What allowed, after 40 years of nothing, or 50 years in some cases of nothing, all of a sudden all the 6 GCC countries and states beyond that began raising energy prices on their citizens? Well, first of all, the Arab Spring fizzled out, right? And that made, that basically pushed, there was a sort of I can talk a bit more about that in the Q&A, but you had this kind of insecurity around ISIS and sort of this protracted chaos in some states that kind of rallied citizens around their rulers and made it easier to extract austerity. Second, oil prices plummeted. That black line coursing through this chart is the oil price, okay? So you can see most of these occurred during or after the initial plunge, in the 2014, after that OPEC meeting in November of 2014. That always brings about expectations of austerity. And then the third thing, 3 months after that OPEC meeting, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia passed away. His the new king, Salman, was really less cautious with policy making, but he put his 30-year-old son, Mohammed bin Salman, in control of the key parts of the economy, and he was even less cautious still. And one of the first, and I think one of the best things that Mohammed bin Salman did was to raise energy prices in Saudi Arabia, first in 2016 and again in 2018. As you can see, some other countries did the same thing, but really the Saudi reforms I get into pretty deeply in the book are by far the most comprehensive in the Gulf. Okay, so prices in the Gulf are still low by international standards, but we're starting now to see some changes in demand. Again, I get into pretty detailed discussions and show some data on this in my book, but the big one is oil demand in Saudi Arabia. And we're starting to see that finally plateauing and maybe even coming down, okay? Again, the other Gulf monarchies, it hasn't quite come across this dramatically yet, but I think we can say that, energy demand in the Gulf is still problematic, but these countries are turning the corner. Their governments understand, I think, that, they can push these reforms through. There are channels for this, that their people aren't rebelling, at least not, not too much. I mean, I think there were a few protests about this in Oman, but they're not, I think it could be, I think they envisioned that it would be a lot worse. But just as the monarchies are turning the corner on this problem, another one comes along, okay? And that is the one I want to finish up with here, climate change. So for the Gulf, I think climate change is a tougher problem, okay? So for two reasons. First, since fossil fuel emissions are the main cause, they fear that the solution, selling less oil and gas, is going to be worse than the disease. Now, I could talk a bit about the emissions contribution to the Gulf, maybe in the Q&A if we want to. I can come back to this slide, but just in the interest of time, I'll move forward. but let's just say here that it's not a trivial contribution. But the second reason climate is such a tough problem for the Gulf is that the Persian Gulf is also on the front lines of climate damage. Okay, so these countries stand to be pretty early victims of climate. So the summers in the Gulf are already incredibly hot and humid. We had high temperatures in 2016 in Kuwait City and in Basra that went above 129 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, now that is pretty sweltering. If they get much worse, really, what this chart is showing is that by 2070 or 2080, some of the coastal Gulf cities could face temperatures that are really just beyond the human body's ability to cope or to endure. Okay, so the combination of heat and humidity is the big one in the Gulf. So if the Gulf rulers want their people to be able to survive during a protracted summer blackout, okay, like the one I experienced in Dubai in, when was that? 2008, I think. 2000, maybe a little earlier. I mentioned it in the introduction of the book. They really need the world to get emissions in check. Okay, so they have sort of bifurcated interests on climate. So right now, I think their focus is on this first problem of hampering their marketing of oil and gas. But really, I think they need to look at the totality of the problem. So my book concludes with a pretty detailed look at climate policy in the Gulf. I don't want to give that all away here. I'll give you a few hints before I shut down. Some of it is pretty smart, okay? Non-combustion uses for crude oil, so especially petrochemicals is probably their biggest climate hedge. But also cleaning up the upstream, reducing flaring, reducing the carbon footprint of their crude oil and the products that are made from them. They're also having a lot of success doing. But one way or another, climate change is still going to disrupt life in the Gulf eventually, right? So I think if climate action around the world succeeds, Gulf economies are going to have to diversify, and that might mean a change in political systems. If those climate policies globally fall short, I think the Gulf is going to face an unwinnable confrontation with an increasingly hostile environment. So either way, it's going to be a pretty challenging road for the Gulf monarchies. And that's all I've got for you in the presentation.
All right. Jim, thank you very much for that presentation, which I will tell you, I hope it has the effect of whetting your appetite to read the book. It is well worth reading. It is a very readable book and very thorough and well constructed, so I'm very much a fan. Two bits of housekeeping that I should mention. One, I neglected to say at the outset that after we finish our question and answer session, we'll have an opportunity for a little bit of a reception out in the elevator lobby outside, and an opportunity therefore for members of the audience to interact directly with Jim or with Amy. Secondly, let me remind all audience members, both here and at home or at your desk, wherever you may be, that you may pose questions at any time using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. So, Jim, I guess where I'd like to start our discussion in this segment of the conversation is by kind of pulling out a little bit one of the core elements of your narrative as I understood it reading the book. We remember, many of us in the room, I suspect, the famous words of the person who was referred to as the father of OPEC. That would be Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso, the Venezuelan Minister of Mines and Hydrocarbons, who famously referred to oil as the devil's excrement. And that view, I think it is safe to say, enjoys a certain support among some segment of the general public, even today, even as we buy, as a society, large SUVs and live distant from our workplaces, etc. But your narrative is, it seems to me, Jim, quite different. either neutral or perhaps even sympathetic about the role that oil has played in the states that you are examining. Yes, lots of challenges around the easy access to supply of energy, and yes, environmental challenges that we'll come to maybe a little bit later in the discussion, but fundamentally revenues by which these countries have developed. And I'd like to ask you just to say a little bit more. How do you see this difference between maybe the narrative that is out there, including from the former minister, and how you found the topic? And Amy, I'd like to please. I hope you'll jump in and comment thereafter.
Yeah, sure. So the oil curse literature that you're talking about, I think it's a very rich strain in the academic literature that, and there's, it's like a tennis game. You get the ball keeps going back and forth, and the arguments come, they're refuted, and then they're rebolstered. So I think for the Gulf, these countries, it's pretty much been an unambiguously positive effect. I think the only negative book that I've ever read about oil-fueled development in the Gulf is that book "Cities of Salt" by Abdulrahman Munif. I don't know if you know. It's a novel written by a Saudi a gentleman who was. I think he was later kicked out of the country for writing it. It's a good read. I mean, it's a very interesting book, and I quote the book in here. But I also show. I think I do a lot of anecdotes about Oman, because I think with Oman, I think the changes that oil-funded development brought are just outrageous. I've never seen anything quite so quick, right? So in and there's even a graph in the book that shows that I think there were just a couple of schools in Oman in 1970 when the coup took place. So there was a ruler who wanted to prevent basically development and oil-funded development. So there have been some small discoveries of oil. Basically prevented a development from happening, and his son threw him out in 1970, and then used oil to develop that country, basically into the Switzerland of the Middle East, right? So if anybody's ever been to Oman, it is a stunning country. It's not as rich as some of the neighboring countries, but the education's fantastic. Omani's got something like 30 extra years of life. Their life expectancy went up from 45 to 75. Their literacy went up, to almost, the 90s or something from somewhere, I don't know, in the 40s or 50s. It's a pretty, by every indicator you can look at, the Gulf countries did really well from oil. And if they hadn't, if you think about a counterfactual, if they hadn't discovered oil, what would they look like? Probably something like Somalia, right? Somalia might not be a bad one. Somalia was a little bit more developed than the Gulf countries were. If you look, at Mogadishu, a bit of a larger, more developed city. But in the book, I do argue, though, that, if you take the oil curse literature seriously, I think there's a second stage, right? And there's a lot of different oil curse literature, but if you one thing that it does, I think you can argue that it does is that it cements the status quo political system into place, right? So if you're Norway and you've got great democratic institutions, it bolsters those. If you're a tribal autocracy with sheikhly rulers, it helps them stay in place. But there's a second stage that where if you say oil boosts autocracy, well, autocracy also boosts oil because those rulers then have a pretty high incentive to give oil away for free or for at a very low price, and that countries that have discovered oil that are autocracies have very high levels of domestic consumption. So.
Let me take that one on too, because I love the way Jim described this part in the book, and it's something that I've given a lot of thought. If you think about the difference, because you're quoting someone from Venezuela, and we think about where Venezuela is today and contrast that with where the Gulf is today. Jim, you mentioned this sort of political culture. of the families and the sheikdoms. And I think there is this cultural difference where I have a responsibility as a leader in these countries in the Gulf to make sure that I'm providing for my citizens. And in historical times, it was almost like a gift that the ruler was obligated to give to his citizens. And so, fresh water, energy, in some cultures, you actually got your housing for free back in the day when, money was less tight. So this provided just an unbelievable pace of development and improvement for citizens. Where in Latin America, you have this sort of history of populism. And the oil, there's probably corruption across many societies that are oil exporting and producing societies, but in Latin America, you've had this volatility in how the oil revenue was spent that has not turned out to be eliminating poverty and the kinds of things that have happened in the Gulf. Now, that's the positive side. But I do feel, and you mentioned Oman. I've been to Oman. If you go to traditional regions out in the countryside in Oman, there are still people of the older generation that have chosen to live in the way that they've lived for centuries. And when you contrast that to this younger generation that lives in these sort of skylines that you showed, it is really kind of unbelievable how much economic progress has been made. But the flip side is there is a dark side to oil. And there have been conflicts across the Gulf where this discussion about how much rent is a justifiable amount of rent to take from the product and how permanent can that rent be? Is it rent for a year if you make the price too high? Is it rent just for a short period of time and then suddenly you have a collapse in price? And so we've seen this volatility in these societies that are dependent on, highly dependent on oil revenue to make the society function well. And we can talk about it if people are interested in it. I probably have a slightly different opinion than maybe other people who've studied it, but I've looked at the cycle and have written a book and a more recent statistical article that really shows that part of the up and down of the cycle that I think the countries need to really move away from and have not all of them have successfully done so. So I get a lot of revenue from this oil, and people have done great things with that revenue, but they've also spent it on armaments. And we've argued that the armament spending is endogenous to the pattern of oil prices going up and down. And then when the price of oil comes down, it brings out these instabilities that were already there under the surface, and you're heavily armed. So if you think about a regime like Saddam Hussein's regime, right, enabled to have all this weaponry and then using it on your neighbors, right? And so it's hard for me to say, when I look across the broader region, that oil has just done these miraculous things for these societies, because we've seen multiple societies literally get destroyed and rebuilt. And I think that the oil cycle is part of that process. And so in the Middle East, in a way that the problems in Latin America are more severe in some levels. We look at what happened to Venezuela today, but still, pretty destructive as a force.
Well, but it seems to me also, Amy, that there's see if you agree with this. I mean, the oil component of those national narratives, I think you're right, is complex. Of course, the oil component has both supply and demand sides, right? So that's the other piece of this picture that in a big demand country that I think we probably do well to remember. Let me take a turn a little bit, unless you have something else you want to say on this, Jim, and go into the question of decision making in the Gulf countries about price levels, because I thought another very interesting thread in your book that that comes out in a couple of different places, but that doesn't necessarily relate to the choice of domestic pricing. It goes to the price levels and the historical understanding that I think was pretty strong in a number of the Gulf countries, the producer countries, that there was a risk to their own interests arising from overly high prices or upward price volatility. And I think I'd like to ask you to comment, maybe draw out this thread a little bit, because we are living, of course, in a time when tweets go out before every successive meeting of the OPEC Plus group. Seems to me there's a pretty good understanding of that demand destruction risk among those countries.
Yeah, so I think there is, and I think they've all got a sort of a different perspective on it. Every OPEC country is has a unique perspective. They all have a different kind of budget break-even price, the price of crude that they need to fund their government budgets, and those government budget break-even prices also go up and down all the time, right? So there, a country might be hawkish on price, 1 year, and then be, a little more amenable to lower prices, a few years later when they've gotten their budget in order, or after, a few good years. The Saudis are traditionally, have the longest view. I think there's some, stuff in the book about, the Saudi reserve size, and especially, King Abdullah's kind of enforcement of this, gradualist approach to producing oil. Like he said that, I think there's a quote from him in there saying that, certain fields that we found, we've just said, let's leave this in the ground for future generations. We don't need to produce this now. There's some discussion about each field, wanting to be produced for a few decades, right? And depletion rates for those fields kept at very low levels. So all this is part of a gradualist approach to save oil and the oil economy for future generations, and to kind of slowly convert that into above ground assets that the countries can use. And I think there's a change in thinking about that now as we see this threat to oil, and that there's a lot of thinking that Saudi Arabia or other countries might want to take a little bit of a compressed approach, maybe a shorter term approach to production, maybe not such a gradualist approach. But that gradual approach basically means that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, the other Gulf monarchies, with the world's cheapest oil, right? The lowest lifting costs in the world, they leave a big portion of demand unmet, and they allow higher cost producers to meet that demand, and that pushes the prices up. So in general, the way OPEC has behaved, no different than the Seven Sisters or the Texas Railroad Commission also enforcing quotas on production, has forced oil prices up and has allowed them to make a pretty comfortable living on this. But of course, as Amy mentioned, that doesn't, it works over the long term, but volatility is always a problem in the oil markets, and I'm sure it's going to be for a long time. Maybe shale might moderate it somewhat, at least for the next few years.
Well,
but,
I think one of the things that's happening, and I think it's going to be a big concern out in the Gulf as this sort of concept becomes more widely understood. So if shale winds up shortening the cycle, so I don't have to wait so what happens is oil prices start to go up, and if you're an oil company, you'd have to go out and increase your budget for drilling. And maybe by the time you would get a new find in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico or in Africa or in the Russian Arctic, it would take you 7 to 10 years to bring on a new oil field, and it might be very large. So come on in a lumpy way might cause some price volatility. But while you had this gap, we in the Western world might have a recession from the high oil price. We might feel under pressure from the high oil price, but it gave a country like Saudi Arabia multiple years to build up foreign reserves, which are then used, fat years, lean years, right? But if we're going to have this very short cycle where the price of oil is going to go up, and then we're going to have extra drilling in the United States, or maybe next it'll be Argentina or some other location, and even the majors themselves are short cycling by going to what we call legacy assets. So I have a field in the Gulf of Mexico, and there was a little tiny field next to it, and I might not have bothered with that because I was looking for some giant field in, the Caspian. But now I'm going to just do that small field in the Gulf of Mexico. So you're going to have more oil coming out faster. And the oil companies, even the majors, are bringing on new fields in Africa in like 3 years, right? So the cycle is really crunching down. And that means that in the Gulf, I'm not going to have 7 years of plenty. I might not even have 3 years of plenty. I'm going to have this cycle where, the kind of downward pressure is going to come much more rapidly. And I think that's going to be a challenge in terms of the needs of the population, much higher populations in some of these countries, Saudi Arabia in specific. So I think that that's sort of a challenge that's not well recognized yet. And it goes to what you're talking about, budget planning. I'm planning my budget, and in my mind, I'm thinking that these high prices are going to last for this long or that long. And there's some misconceptions. For example, one misconception is that Russia is running low on its future oil reserves. We have a lot of companies that don't want to invest anymore in the Arctic because it's very expensive. But actually, Russia has really prolific shale, much like the U.S. shale. And so the idea that Russia is somehow depleting its resources is, pretty inaccurate. So I do think that this pressure of, how the cycle might change over time because of the shale is beyond just the this year or next year, how much U.S. oil production will there be, and how does that get adopted into the market?
So I want to just do a couple maybe quicker hits, although there's a lot to unpack here. One of the things I think that's very interesting about the frame from which you look at this issue in your book, Jim, is that you are looking at decision-making by these countries, taking the decision to start looking for the way to remove subsidies, when to do it, how to do it, et cetera. Talk a little bit, please, about what are the options, what are the best ways that have been employed, what have been the elements of success in the Gulf or elsewhere in removing energy subsidies, because it's certainly, as you say in the book at one point, these are sticky, hard to remove because people in the society get accustomed to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty notorious if when you start giving favorable economic treatment to a group of people, they start to coalesce around those interests. They have these like interests, and that you create this almost like your future opposition by giving people something that you later have to take away, because they'll rally around their interests, and it's difficult to take it away. In the Gulf, it's the entire society got these subsidies, and they started narrowing them in some countries that had a lot of expatriate immigration. They began taking the subsidies away from the expatriate populations first. So this happened in Dubai and some of the other Emirates in the UAE, and then now Bahrain is doing it, Qatar is doing it. Looks like Kuwait's going that way. So they do that first, and the expatriates don't have the same level of political clout that citizens do. So they're not really required. Their support isn't really required. They're on typically three-year work visas. They don't, the ruling family doesn't really need their political support. But when you start tinkering with these long-held benefits of citizens who do have political clout, and then you're starting to get into a pretty tricky policy, and it's what seems to be one key factor, I think, is that these regimes are so centralized, right? They're about as centralized of a type of governance as you can get, right? There's really, at the end of the day, one guy calling the shots. And in the UAE, there's, maybe there's another layer there, but because it's a federal system, but very centralized regimes. And so there's only one place for the blame to go from society when something's taken away, right? So, so the ruler needs to have some type of political cover for doing this. Otherwise, or he has to do it at a time when he feels strong enough to be able to absorb the the backlash. And so I gave three rationales. There's a few more that I go into in the book, but one being the fall in oil prices. I mean, that all of these countries had these plans basically under the desk, and when the oil price fell, the time wasn't right to press them into action in 2011. Dubai actually did. I mean, there's a case study in my book where Dubai actually raised prices in 2011, and then wound up, the Arab Spring kicked off almost simultaneously when Dubai raised prices, and they wound up retracting some of that. They had to actually unwind some of that. They left some of it in place, but they took some of it away, and there was a big outcry among citizens, of course. And so the other governments weren't quite as under the gun as Dubai was at that time, with the crash, and so they waited till the oil price fell. They had great political cover from that. They had great political cover from the rise of ISIS. I mean, in 2014, Iraq, large parts of Iraq were being held by ISIS. ISIS was strong in Syria. You had some bombings that were starting to trickle into to Saudi Arabia, and then in Kuwait, a major mosque bombing in Kuwait that I lead, I think, chapter 9 with anecdote about that attack. That really upset this. Very secure countries all of a sudden started to feel insecure, and people that might have said, "Okay, I'm interested in democracy with this Arab Spring stuff," they were like, "No, forget democracy. We're going to start, rallying around our leaders," and that also made it easier for these leaders to basically trade security for subsidy reform, right? So there was kind of almost like a change in the social contract that occurred because of all that insecurity. And then I think, as I mentioned, Mohammed bin Salman, I mean, one thing you can definitely say about Mohammed bin Salman is he is not a cautious policymaker. He's, pretty risk-averse guy, and he, economic policy is, I think you had so much risk aversion built up over the years of King Abdullah's reign. I mean, he was so famously risk averse. There's some anecdotes in the book about, the frustration of technocrats in Saudi Arabia trying to reform subsidies and getting nowhere. So there was a lot of pent up frustration that really kind of spiraled out. I guess one more thing is just to kind of, it seems to work really well, is to level with your people, have a good communications policy on this, talk to them. I mean, my polling showed this, that if you just say, "Hey, how'd you like to pay the full cost of energy to people?" They're like, "No, no thanks." But if you say, "Well, it's in the national interest," then they're like, "Oh, okay." And then the opposition just melts away, and you've got, there's sort of a hardcore of about a third of the population that still says no, but most people will say, "Okay, well, it's in the national interest. I suppose I can take a hit."
I guess I would just point out, because I was so struck with your last slide, in thinking about the subsidies and thinking about people's oil use. I mean, this conundrum of what's going to happen with temperatures and water in the region is so devastating that I think that maybe people are not giving people enough credit. Like, part of what could assure that we're not going to have a brownout is not to have excessive demand, right? And so I think that, and I see that even in the United States, it's so very hard to talk about climate change. I mean, forget the fact that there's a whole segment of the population that doesn't believe in the science. It's even just hard because if I could get everybody to say, "Okay, we're not going to reject the science," but then we would talk about some of the things we have to prepare for, even on the health side. It's, some of it's a little scary. And so, and all of it, well, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it is really manageable if you could have an open dialogue about what could come and how we would prepare for that and what we would have to do. And because we're unable to have that dialogue, not only here in the United States, but especially probably in the Gulf, then I think it just makes it so much harder. But I think that these things are not disconnected. And it's not just the financial part. They're not disconnected because, even forget, is this country A or country B going to join the Paris Accords? It's really about how am I going to manage my electricity system to make sure that no one, wouldn't it be horrible to have someone die because I haven't managed my electricity demand? I think if you think about it in that way, I think about it in that way having lived in California. Like we're not managing our infrastructure, even in California where it's very easy to talk about the science of climate change, and yet we're not managing it well. I mean, literally, I live near this town that disappeared in California. So I think that, allowing a little bit more of a discussion is probably going to be really necessary.
Jim, I'm kind of interested to pose the question in this way. I mean, be interested in your impression about the extent to which you see a link in either the popular understanding, the popular discussion between subsidy and what happens to the climate. My impression, and it is impressionistic, from my own travels to the Gulf Arab states, is that you have some people who are very strongly in the doubter, skeptic camp, don't accept the science. Others who very much do and are very busy in the business of figuring out how to reduce the climate impacts arising from the way that they have traditionally made a lot of their income. How do you see this kind of playing out? And while you're thinking on that, I'll just do a please get ready, because I'm going to come to the audience for questions next. Jim, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, so it is becoming a debate. I mean, there's more and more articles. It wasn't a big debate when I was living there until 2009, but it's increasing now. I mean, policymakers are not only very well aware of it, but they're also preparing their, especially their electrical, the power systems for increasing load, and they are, I think, they understand all too well the dangers of not having sufficient power to meet demand. So that's a big thing, and the opportunity cost of overconsumption is also a big thing, and so they're trying to diversify away from, not having a lot of success, but there's some success in moving toward renewables and nuclear, and taking some of the power load off these fossil fuels that they can export, because there's an opportunity cost benefit as well, right? So there's kind of a double, a twofer in policy there. I mean, the IMF has been really pressuring the Gulf monarchies. Christine Lagarde has made a huge issue of energy subsidies and the climate ills of energy subsidies. She's been pushing them very hard on that. The G20, as you mentioned in our chit chat, I mean, they have also done this. So I think it's a big, it's getting to be a big issue. Unfortunately, some places, some of the Gulf monarchies are seeking energy security in an unfortunate way, let's say, and so Dubai is an example, turning to coal. Okay, so the one fossil fuel not found in the Gulf. I mean, increasing temperatures are going to increase electricity demand, and we're going to have this sort of negative cycle. But turning to coal to try and meet that extra demand, try to diversify your energy security, I think is, I think it's an unfortunate decision. I hope other monarchies in the Gulf don't go down that route.
So let me open up. I see a hand here in the back, and Patrick will bring you a mic. Please formulate it as a question. If you would please also do us a favor and introduce yourself as you start.
Good evening. My name is William Smith. With Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 strategy, their plan and their reluctance to have an IPO with Saudi Aramco, how do you see? How do you see the kingdom being able to diversify its reliance on fossil fuels while also trying to promote a sustainable strategy?
I think we're all going to have an opinion on this one. I know, but
Actually, let's just get a
couple. All right.
couple others. Gentleman here.
This is the
Oh,
IPO.
okay, that's good. Yep.
Hi there, Michael Dobson. I'm down at the New School. Thanks very much. Really interesting conversation. Very much looking forward to reading the book. But Jim, I read one of your working papers from last year, and you had on Saudi climate policy, and it concluded with a really kind of interesting thought about what might happen to OPEC once we hit peak demand, and we're into a diminishing global market, and the possibility of using OPEC to sort of equitably attribute oil production. That struck me as really fascinating, and I'd be really interested to hear from you and from others on the panel what role OPEC might play once we get over the hump. Thanks.
Okay, and just one more, and then we'll go take a round of answers here, please.
Question for Mr. Kane. Albert Golson, focusing on geopolitical risk. Could you please talk about another exploding cost that particularly Saudi Arabia would have, and that would be their demographics and healthcare. Back in 1970, the average lifespan of a Saudi male was in its early 40s. Currently, it's in the lower to mid-70s. Additionally, the obesity rate in Saudi Arabia is exploding. In fact, it's probably twice the level of Western countries. How does the Saudi government plan to tackle those challenges?
Okay, so we've got Vision 2030 and future strategy for Saudi Aramco, future of OPEC, and the notion of peak demand and the explosion in demographics and healthcare challenges in the kingdom. Three small and easy questions. Take us away, Jim.
So on the IPO and the diversification, I think the IPO of Saudi Aramco is essentially a good idea. I mean, you've got this, basically this, economy that's dependent on for majority of its GDP and government budget and exports on oil, right? So, and if they can diversify some of that risk, and you have this, the climate problem, and that's looming. So I think they need to diversify some of that risk. I think maybe IPOing the mothership of Saudi Aramco, where you especially on an exchange like that in New York, where transparency requirements are so high, and you have to get into disclosing the reserves and a lot of the information that the Aramco now and the Saudi minister keeps close to his vest. I think that was probably a strategic. It would have been difficult to do that, I think, and you would have seen the Saudi oil minister. Probably, anybody with a smartphone would have been able to get data that Minister Al-Fallah keeps close to, and sort of releases this stuff and makes these statements that are so. It gives them so much gravitas at these international events and whatnot. So I think it would have been kind of a loss of maybe some of the strategic power that the ambiguity gives the minister in Saudi Arabia. Diversification, of course, is necessary. I think it's looked upon in the Gulf as something that they're reluctant to do because oil is one of those weird industries that has this rent component that persists over time, for various reasons, one of which is, restrictions on output that other business sectors just don't have, and it gets driven out over time by competition. So when you start getting beyond oil and moving away from oil, you start getting away from that larger profit margin in those rents. And so, I think countries are reluctant to do that anyway. OPEC and Climate, I was kind of speculating in that paper, and I have to write another one on that very topic, and I haven't started it yet. My thinking was, and it's kind of half-baked, but I guess I'll talk about it briefly. Was that if you thought about, OPEC, it could be a force for good in dividing up markets and sort of apportioning shares of the crude market. So, rather than restrictions on output, they could flip that around and apportion market shares, percentage market shares, based on various attributes, but one of which could be the carbon footprint of the crude oil that's produced, right? So if so it would be, it would encourage countries to stop flaring, or to use, less energy-intensive oil recovery techniques, and so so it could be a force for good, and it could also prevent this sort of green paradox scenario from happening, where you have these oil-producing countries that see, the end of oil, and they don't want their resources stranded, so they start pumping more than than the market demands, and that pushes prices down, and you have, oil becomes more attractive, and demand goes back up. So, so if you had like a stronger OPEC that had a slightly different mandate, it could be a good thing. On the population and the health care, I really, honestly, healthcare and issues is something I know absolutely nothing about. So I might have to punt on that one. Sorry.
Well, let me just very briefly. The Crown Prince has done some very interesting things, and right now maybe they're not as visible. But if you think about the Saudi fashion industry emerging, and some of these sort of service-oriented industries, one of the things the Crown Prince has done that I think has been very positive is he's shown himself as a person who is working, to try to show in a leadership way that younger people in Saudi Arabia need to think of themselves as working and taking initiative. So I think that's been a positive thing in the society, to sort of enable people to think about how they might shape their future by having a cafe or having a startup business, or educating themselves to be in robotics or some other field. But in the end, there is no shortcut. And there's been sort of a lack of willingness, which I see changing, in reforming the education system. 10, 20 years ago, a lot of people wanted to stay in university, and one of the longest majors, apparently, in university out in the Gulf is you can major in religion, and you can, get an advanced degree in that, and you stay in university for multiple years. And because there were less jobs in engineering, as the industry wasn't expanding, people did that, but then you're not having a workforce that's competitive in the global market for these new kinds of things like design and computers and digital. So I understand the principle of Vision 2030, which was to convert some oil asset and try to invest in an Uber or something like that, and have a diverse income stream, right? And of course, Dubai has done that unbelievably successful. They went from being 50% dependent on oil revenue to be something like 4% dependent on oil revenue today.
And even less than that, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's been incredibly successful in what they've done with investments. But I do think that in the end, because Saudi Arabia is a large population, it is really about education. It's about taking a new generation of people and educating them in a way that they will be able to be competitive in a global society. They'll be able to cope with and be inventive about solutions to some of the problems that might be more regionally oriented, whether that's a health, going into the health field, or whether it's going into design, as we've seen, or entertainment. I mean, there's just all kinds of things that could be done, and I do think that having people moving to a place where people, and I think this younger generation is willing to do that. The challenge you have, and you see that in other countries, is moving younger people to the place where they're empowered economically, in a society where you don't want them to be empowered politically. You see that challenge in China, right? So as an American, for me, it's a little bit harder, I think, to envision how to have a society where people are going to be empowered economically and be empowered to take an initiative economically, and still have a very top-down society. I think there's a tension there that can be managed, but there's a tension there.
All right, let's get a next round of questions. I see a gentleman in the back, and then here on the aisle.
My name is Dan Pinkel. My question has to do with what goes on in all those buildings in those countries? What does the energy consumption do? Is it producing a society which becomes independent of oil, or what's going on?
And then over here, Patrick.
My name is Henry Burbank, and I am curious about how in the past 50 years we've seen a shift away from vertically integrated distribution models and more towards spot markets and trading. And how has that changed the incentive structures for the Gulf monarchies? And do you see any indications that there may be a similarly significant change in distribution models in the future?
You mean in oil or in oil and gas? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, and then last question here in the front, and we'll do another round.
Rudolph Hauser, retired economist. In terms of the global warming change, what impact would rising sea levels have on the Gulf countries, and how significant in terms of cost would it be to deal with that? And how much energy is going to be used for the need to provide more water in terms of desalination or other energy uses to convert unusable water into potable water?
So we've got what is creating the energy demand in all those buildings? How are changes in oil markets and trading evolving the interests and the implications for the Gulf Arab states, and climate-related sea level rise and desal energy demand?
Okay, well, I'll take a crack at all three here. So what's going on in the buildings? You mean the efficiency of these buildings, the energy efficiency?
What's the economic activity?
Oh.
What is it doing?
Right.
Well, it's providing cooling, right? So I'd say about between 70 and 80% of power demand in the Gulf goes for cooling, right? It's a cooling load. If you look at just power demand, right? So, there's a lot of energy that's used in transportation, especially in Saudi Arabia. It's a big country. It's like sort of the western portion of the United States. There's long distances. So everything, in Dubai, even the public bus shelters, the bus stops along the streets are air conditioned. The metro is air conditioned. The metro stops are air conditioned. So it's almost it's already very hot there, and and so some of the demand is excess demand, I would argue, because some of these buildings have been designed badly. They're like, Western skyscraper designs that you'd see in a northern city that are good at collecting solar energy passively, right? So they collect the sun's rays, and then you need to have actually a larger HVA system to cool them in this climate, right? So they don't use shading very well, a lot of these buildings. And a lot of times they're built cheaply without insulation or insulated glass or sophisticated controls technology or reflective roofing, or, so they could have been designed to be more environmentally benign. That's also part of the load is due to that, but low energy prices have kind of disincentivized really efficient construction methods, right? So there's part of that. There's sort of a chicken and egg problem that you have with, since energy is cheap, people build, sprawling cities with large buildings that are inefficient, and so efficiency needs to tighten up, but you need energy prices higher to encourage efficiency to improve, right? So there's a lot of that there. Let's see. Rising sea levels and desalination issues. So if you think about the Persian Gulf cities, the city along the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, the Gulf is it's like one of these seas that starts out very shallow. You walk out a little ways and it's an inch deep, and you walk out a little further and it's like 2 inches deep, and then it's a very sort of a shallow kind of calm, benign sea, so I don't think sea level rise is going to be a really insurmountable problem. There are already lots of work going on the coastlines to replenish beaches because, well, especially in Dubai, they've built all these artificial islands that have changed the currents. But if you can build I mean, they've gone into the mountains and basically blasted out enormous boulders with armies of trucks dumping them onto the seafloor and then raising these artificial islands, compacting those. I mean, if you're the type of society that can put that kind of infrastructure construction together, I mean, I don't think you're going to have a big problem with sea level rise. I mean, Dubai, I would be just astonished. I'd wake up, in the morning and be going to work, and the road would have been moved. It would have picked up the road and moved it over a little ways because they were going to build something else. I mean, it was just like they moved the road overnight. I mean, so it's just this is not a this is very capable. Engineering and construction and fundraising and everything societies over there.
Of course, none of that is without cost, right? That adaptation is a big that's a big ticket universe.
And if you look at the IMF's GDP estimates for countries based on what the climate change is going to cost them, the Gulf monarchies are among the ones with the highest cost, and a lot of that is due to adaptation costs, right? So that's expensive. And actually, some of the countries that they caucus with in some of these climate talks, like Russia, they're going to face actually like a positive effect on GDP from climate change. So they're I think their interests are a lot different than other oil exporting countries' interests when it comes to climate change. They don't have, so desalination is a big issue, and water use is way too high. I mean, water use in the Gulf is almost the same as what Canada uses, right? Canada is covered with water. It's got so much fresh water. In the Gulf, it's all, almost all used it's almost all desalinated. Good on the positive side. Solar energy is a good way to desalinate water because intermittency doesn't really hurt you. It's when the sun's out during the day, you can produce a lot of water, and then you drain the tanks overnight. So there can be ways of moving that away from purely fossil fuels that'll lower the carbon footprint of desalination, but I don't think you get away from desalination itself. What was the other one?
The other one was changes in trading and in markets for crude oil.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that.
Saudi Aramco has sort of come and gone in terms of, I think they're coming back into a phase where they're looking at more trading. In LNG, you're going to have an incredibly higher amount of trading. QP has always been a little innovative in how they do their marketing and how they think about using the spear in their trains. They have these trains and you can expand them or contract them over different periods of time. And I think you probably see more of that in the future, from across the region. But I want to take one more second.
Please.
Very short. I'm going to do an Amy Jaffe. John won't know what that means. I'm going to say something really blunt and controversial. But I think it's important to say in the context of the climate change and what is the important thing in climate change in the Gulf, right? So if you go back to the 70s, you mentioned the 70s, one of the things that President Ford had to make a decision about was whether or not, when there was a coalition of countries using oil as a so-called weapon, was the United States going to talk about its food exports and Western countries' food exports in the same kind of context. And Ford decided that that was an immoral thing, that it would be immoral to think about food in that way, which I think is true. And so he made a very famous speech about that and kind of called on the oil exporting countries to think about the importance of their commodity in the same way. And I think that when we move forward, we're going to have volatility in oil prices, and there's still probably going to be times in the market when certain producers might have market power and they have to decide whether to use it or not, or there might be political disputes and Russia or some other country has to decide whether to use it or not. Thinking about the global interdependence and the constraints of water and the constraints of food, when you look at these food scarcity and water scarcity charts that people make about the global systems, the Gulf is going to be very, very dependent on the few societies that are going to be able to grow sufficient food to export it. And you see China's entire policy is focused on this food security. And you see other societies thinking about food security. And there are synthetic ways to think about food security. People talking about making protein out of insects and so forth. So I'm not saying it can't be creative or, done in a laboratory. But my point to you is the way we globally need to think about these kinds of resources is going to become more important. And the way that the Gulf thinks about food security and water security is going to become more important. And we don't talk about that. Mm-hmm. And it's a really important subject. So that's why I thought I'd weigh in on it.
All right. I think, unfortunately, we have reached the point where we ought to, well, fortunately or unfortunately, we should shift from this format to a format with a glass in the hand of anybody that would like to have a glass in his or her hand. But before I let you go, I want to just mention a handful of upcoming public events that the Center on Global Energy Policy has in the weeks ahead. So first, let me bring to your attention on February 5th, which is Tuesday of next week. We'll have a program on crude volatility, no end in sight to the boom-bust prices. This will involve Bob McNally, who roughly 2 years ago released the first in the book series that Jim's book now joins. McNally will be joined by Jamie Webster from BCG, Marianne Kaw from the Center on Global Energy Policy, and Antoine Half, my colleague who is sitting here with us tonight. Then on the 6th of February, we will look at the question of climate change solutions, particularly in the context of the new Congress. We will have as the headliner that evening Carlos Curbelo, who is a former Republican member of Congress from Florida, who was the co-founder of the Climate Solutions Caucus and is now a distinguished visiting fellow at our center. He will be joined by Christina Costa from the Center for American Progress, Alex Flint from the Alliance for Market Solutions, and Rihanna Gunn-Wright from an organization called New Consensus that is doing the policy development for the Green New Deal ideas. Last but not least, on the 26th of February, we will have a program in Midtown which will look at the energy outlook from BP. We will have Spencer Dale, the group chief economist from BP, joined by Shail Khan, who is with Energy Impact Partners now and was with Green Tech Media previously. He's also a non-resident fellow at our center. And Catherine Spector, who is a research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy as well. So I would ask you please to join me in thanking Jim Krane and Amy Jaffe for their contributions tonight. And in the elevator lobby, you will find room for a reception and copies of Jim's book for anybody that hasn't yet purchased it and wishes to do so. Thank you very much.